Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thanks for coming in late on a Thursday afternoon, and thank you, Martha, for the nice introduction and inviting me. It's sort of humbling to give this talk, so I'm going to try to go between two different areas of my research, and Martha and Adrian have sort of started both of those fields, so having them here is an honor to be here, and also makes me maybe mildly more nervous than usual. But thanks everyone for being here. This working, but not so working. Here we go. That works. Okay. So just generally, I'm really interested in how this cute little baby ends up being this boy who's in jail, and he's upset because he's there, and lots of people are sad about the things that he did. And really understanding contextual and biological risk factors that might interact and be mechanisms linking this trajectory of development. So broadly, my research program and lab is trying to understand how things like poverty and wealth inequality and concentrated disadvantage impact more proximal environments for kids. So things like parenting, the neighborhoods, the exposures they have to things like toxicants or violence, and how that in turn impacts physiology. So how that might impact the brain development, which in turn leads to outcomes like antisocial behavior, as well as studying resilience, but I'm not going to get to talk about that today. And then finally, understanding why some kids do better or worse in some of these contexts, right? So lots of different kids will be exposed to the same context, not all will have the same outcomes. And I think doing this approach where we're looking at these sort of mechanisms, interactions, hopefully has some translational implications. So understanding mechanisms can help us understand new treatments or why treatments work. Understanding these interactions can help us target who's most at risk and who should be targeted. And then hopefully with subgroups, you might be able to personalize treatments to make them more effective. I think a really good example of how this basic science can translate is work done by Tom Nishan and Danny Shaw, where they used decades of research longitudinally to understand who's at most risk for conduct problems, and then use the family checkup to personalize those and target them to kids and families who need them most. So just to start, what's antisocial behavior? So I'm talking about destructive behaviors that include things like aggression and rule breaking. In psychiatry or in clinical psychology, it's in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual as conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder as adults. I'm going to try to walk a little tightrope here. Usually I have two different talks, and I'm trying to mash them together because Martha was asking about both antisocial behavior and context in the brain. So this is going to be sort of a broader overview at like 30,000 feet of a bunch of studies, but I'm happy if people want to raise their hands to go into more detail on any of them. And antisocial behavior has a really large public health significance. So they did a study on the Fast Track trial, and they found that every kid who was involved in had conduct disorder in adolescence costs $14,000 more per year than other kids with mental health problems. But these costs get pushed across many different sectors, so schools, juvenile justice. And we think about the lifetime prevalence of conduct disorder being maybe 10% and even higher among boys, and that it can be relatively chronic in nature. This is a really important public health challenge. I'll also say this is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Adrian and I were talking about this earlier. And though lots of other neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism, people have compassion about and think that we need to prioritize funding and treatment for, antisocial behavior doesn't always get that same attention or that same compassion. But again, it is a big public health problem, and it affects not just the kids who are involved in these behaviors in terms of their own life trajectories, but obviously also victims and society. So where are we looking in the brain? So I thought I could give a talk and tell you about our different brain findings, but I think in general, there have now been meta-analyses, and so it's better than a bunch of individual studies. We've proposed a model that antisocial behavior is due to sort of three linked systems. One is the cortical limbic system, which has to do with threat and reward in learning. A second is the prefrontal control system. And a third is the cortical striatal system, which is important for reward processing and learning. This has been a dominant theoretical model. This isn't just ours. James Blair has a really prominent model that's very similar, SE beating as well. I believe Adrian has proposed similar things with adults. And so we think about these three circuits as being really important because they're linked to the more proximal behaviors that kids involved in antisocial behavior show, being reward dominant, being impulsive, and having trouble controlling emotions, and having trouble with empathy. And this is, if you want to learn more about this, we have an annual review that just came out, and a couple of students, Heidi Westerman and Joe Guzman, are authors on this. We were also trying more now with the help of a postdoc, Scott Tillum, to think about this in terms of networks, large-scale brain networks. And these aren't entirely overlapping with the networks I showed you before, but thinking about the default frontal parietal and salient network. So how has this model held up? Again, I could show you a bunch of individual studies from our lab, but there's hundreds. Meta-analyses generally find these regions to be important in terms of antisocial behavior, depending on the meta-analysis you look at. But there's also been some important mega-analysis recently by the Enigma group, where everyone shares their data and then they can analyze across studies. So if you want to check that out, there's this paper by Gao and Stagnis that came out in Lancet Psychiatry. And they basically found structurally that antisocial behavior is associated with sort of widespread differences in terms of brain structure, but they're all really small effects. But I want you to sort of hold on to this model, this cortical limbic, prefrontal, and cortical striatal, because it's going to be important when we talk also about disadvantage. So our general model is the idea that we have these risk factors for adversity that are risk factors for antisocial behavior. They interact with genetic risk. In turn, they preferentially affect these three circuits, which lead to these neurocognitive deficits like inhibitory control deficits, emotion dysregulation, and reward dominant decision-making, which in turn increases the risk for antisocial behavior. And I'll talk at the end of the talk about how the type of antisocial behavior might matter. We might see slightly different trajectories based on that type of antisocial behavior. But what's interesting is that these three circuits have also been linked across a lot of studies to exposure to poverty and adversity. So there's a pretty high overlap between the circuits that we're looking at for antisocial behavior and for poverty. So for the first sort of 2/3 of the talk, I'm going to talk about our work where we've looked at sort of poverty and the mechanisms and context surrounding poverty, how that's linked to brain structure. And then if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about some of our work looking at really early markers for antisocial behavior. Okay. So for, I don't know, 20 or 30 years now, people have been connecting poverty to differences in the brain. There are lots of great reviews. So one by Martha and Daniel Hackman, who I think is coming later this year. Another one by Kim Noble, who's also coming later this year, and Sarah Johnson. And at least when we started doing this work, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a lot of this work had focused on SES, and a lot of it had been on structural aspects of the brain. So we got really interested in whether this was also linked, SES was related to brain function. But really interested in the mechanisms, like what is it about having lower SES or living in poverty that's important for brain development? And is this true for sort of more normative range experiences? There have been a bunch of studies on like Romanian orphanages where you have these really extreme experiences linked to brain function. But we wondered, what about variations in parenting? Like if your parent is harsher than the average parent, is that maybe going to be linked to your brain development? We also wanted to look prospectively to see if these experiences earlier in life might predict brain later, and whether the timing of these experiences mattered. And then since I got to Michigan, got really interested just hanging out with demographers at the Institute for Social Research about who we're actually studying. So we wrote a paper, actually Emily Falk, who's now at Penn, which was very sad for us to lose her, where we talk about the fact that a lot of the studies early on in poverty were really of either very normative samples that really missed people who were actually living in poverty. It was just sort of like middle class versus lower middle class, and whether we're actually representing the people that we're interested in. So we've, all the studies I'm going to talk about have been sampled really thoughtfully to generalize hopefully to a broader population. And then we've also been really interested in understanding these processes in families of color who are facing sort of double adversities of both exposure to poverty, but also structural inequalities more broadly. So the guiding models for our work have been developmental psychopathology and the idea that these are going to be transactions over time between kid and family and their environment and multiple layers of influence. And I think one of the models that's really influenced me a lot is the family stress model, which is by Rand Conger, and one of my colleagues, Vonnie McLeod, has done a lot of work in this area. The idea is that SES and poverty affects child development and their risk for psychopathology by shaping proximal context. So in this case, the idea is that, you know, a 3-year-old kid doesn't know how much money our family has, but the parents do. And when parents are stressed, they tend to be harsher and less warm. I can tell you that when I'm stressed, I'm not nearly as good a parent as when I'm relaxed. And I can tell you that that's on top of a lot of privilege and structures that I already have. You think about a young parent, a single parent who's struggling for money, it's going to be easier to have less optimal parenting. Okay, but before I go into some of the work that we've done, I just want to highlight what I'm not saying. I think that poverty, inequality, SES are all the result of multiple nested systems, and they're rooted in deep inequalities and histories, especially in the US, but really across the globe. And they disproportionately affect people of color. So these are actually, I always show this one. This is because I'm going to show you a map of Detroit later. And this is the redlining codes from Detroit. And when you see also the codes for poverty now, 80 years later, they're very highly overlapping. This is Philly, which I thought might be useful in terms of folks thinking about the structure of Philadelphia now. But what I want to highlight is this is not when we're talking about families and community effects. We're not blaming parents or communities. In fact, what we're trying to understand is what is it about poverty that makes it hard for parents to do the things that they can do well, for communities to do things they can do well. That is, how are we undermining sort of the natural strengths that people have in the first place? Okay, and then finally, the developmental periods that I've been most interested in the toddler and preschool period. If you've had a toddler or preschool kid, probably don't have to tell you this, but they can be a handful. Their brain's really rapidly developing. They have sort of poor emotion regulation, and they have like new abilities to be more autonomous, but not the ability to sort of regulate that emotion. And it's a big time oppressed for parents. That definitely oppressed me when my kids were this age. And then adolescents are really similar times. So kids' brains are again rapidly developing. They're again looking for more autonomy, and their contexts are changing. So a lot of what we've done is been looking at this early period linking to this later period. And again, pointing out these three circuits. At the beginning of the talk, I'm going to focus mostly on the amygdala because this is an area of the brain that mediates our responses to threat. So if I said, like, there's a snake over there, your amygdala is the one that's like, we should pay attention to that. It also initiates the stress system and is important for learning contingencies. There's a lot of growth early in childhood. So when I talk about timing, something we think about. And then it's been linked to antisocial behavior. And so that's why it's been one of the targets for us. Okay, so when I first got to Michigan, one of my first graduate students, Ariana Gard, was really interested in this question of multiple adversities and whether those were linked to antisocial behavior and to amygdala activity. And so we brought a couple of different risk factors together that we thought were really important for antisocial behavior to look to see which were related to amygdala activity. So ones in the home, like SES, ones about parents, like their parenting, and then also the neighborhood that people lived in. And we did a study in collaboration with Danny Shaw, who was my PhD advisor. This is the Pitt Mother and Child Project. It's 310 boys in Pittsburgh. They were just sampled to be boys and low income. And again, we talk about structures. By the time they were 15, already 100 of the 300 had court records. So unfortunately, in Pittsburgh, you can predict court records pretty easily just by knowing that it's a boy and that they're coming from a lower income family. So which adversities were related to amygdala activity? We found out basically all of them were correlated in zero order correlations. They're all correlated with each other, right? Like these are all nested systems. But what was really interesting to us was that two of the strongest, and when you controlled for the overlap of all of them, was not family income or maternal education, was actually harsh parenting and neighborhood deprivation. So these were living in neighborhoods with more folks who were struggling. And Ariana found, using an observational measure of parenting and census data on the neighborhood, that harsh parenting, neighborhood deprivation were related to amygdala activity threat. So this is to fearful faces, which in turn predicted symptoms of antisocial personality disorder later. Parenting and neighborhood were measured when the kid was 2, amygdala activity at 20, and antisocial personality disorder at 20. So when she first proposed this project, I was like, there's no way you're going to find anything across 18 years, but she did. And there's an indirect effect from harsh parenting to antisocial behavior via amygdala activity. That is, maybe the amygdala activity is one of the mechanisms linking harsh parenting to antisocial behavior. Sorry. It's a reminder to get reservations at my favorite restaurant, but I don't need to do that. So this really tuned us in both to parenting and the neighborhood as more proximal contexts associated with poverty. Because one of the things with the poverty literature is like, what is it about not having as many resources that actually affects child behavior? And from there, Ariana got really interested in the timing of parenting. And so we know the amygdala develops earlier in life, and the prefrontal cortex continues to develop through adolescence and actually early adulthood. And so we wanted to know whether the kind of parenting we're having earlier versus late might be more or less related to different parts of your brain. And so for this, we used the study of adolescent to adult neurodevelopment, which is a sub-study of the Future Families study. I need to update this because they changed the name from Fragile Families to Future Families. But this is a birth cohort of 5,000 families across the country that were sampled just to be non-marital births in large US cities. that sampling frame, again, results in having a relatively low-income sample. We invited families from Detroit and Toledo to come join us, and based on the demographics of those cities, it's a mostly Black and African-American sample. And so we saw 237 when the kids were 15. And as you can see, pretty low, medium family incomes. And with the longitudinal data, since the kids have been followed since birth, Ariana was able to look at harsh parenting at ages 3, 5, and 9, and she made growth curves of the trajectory of parenting. And so the intercept sort of tells you where parenting starts when we started measuring at 3, so in this preschool period, right? And then we could look at the trajectory of parenting over time. That is your parent getting harsher or less harsh over time? And what she found was that the intercept, these initial levels of harsh parenting, was related to amygdala activity to angry faces. But that these changes, the slope of this, the change across development, was related to activity in the dorsal anterior cingulate, which is part of this sort of control system in the prefrontal cortex. And this is, again, controlling for earlier parenting, and also even the concurrent parenting the kid was getting. So this has the idea that maybe timing does matter. That is, the part of your brain that's the most rapidly developing when you're having these exposures, it seems to be the most affected. So from there, we got interested, again, going back to her results on the neighborhood, thinking about how neighborhoods might be linked to brain activity. We know as kids get older, they spend more time in the neighborhood. And so we, again, went back to this finding in the Pitt Mother and Child Project and thought about this neighborhood deprivation. One of the findings she had that I didn't tell you about before was, we were mostly focused on response to fearful faces, but she found that kids living in these more disadvantaged neighborhoods actually had greater amygdala activity to neutral faces. This is neutral, by the way, according to Paul Ekman. I find this one terrifying. I don't know if you find it terrifying. It's kind of like a still face paradigm, if you know that. And so, if you're living in a potentially less advantaged neighborhood, being more attentive to these kind of neutral cues might actually be very adaptive, right? So this wasn't, in a sense, surprising, but we thought it was interesting. And so we want to see, could we replicate this finding in the SAND study? And could we look at timing? Luckily, the Pitt Mother and Child Project and the SAND study had really similar measures across ages. And in Pittsburgh, we're measuring at age 20 brain functioning, and in SAND at age 15. And what Ariana found was, again, that in both samples, in early childhood, living in a more disadvantaged neighborhood was related to greater amygdala activity to neutral faces. And then she found only in the SAND study that, again, later exposure to neighborhood disadvantage during adolescence was related to greater activity in dorsal ACC. So again, similar parenting that we're seeing, that early experiences seem to be related to the subcortical systems. Later experiences are related to prefrontal cortex. So just to summarize this part, so we found that parenting predicts blunted amygdala activity to fear and anger, but neighborhood disadvantage predicts greater reactivity to these neutral cues. And we think there might be some developmental specificity, maybe the amygdala during preschool years and the prefrontal cortex later. We've done more recent extensions of this. One of the grad students in my lab now, Cleanthus Michael, has done really awesome work in this, using fancier brain stuff, so using graph theory approaches to look at more large-scale brain networks. And he found that neighborhood poverty predicts the segregation of these functional brain organization, but only during adolescence. So again, seems to be the sort of broader parts later. He also has some really cool work that I found out I'm not allowed to tell you because it's embargoed for a month. But I can tell you there's more cool stuff using some advanced techniques to really look at timing effects. And we do sort of see the idea that things that are developing earlier seem to be associated with early exposures and parts of the brain that are developing later with later exposures. So our next questions from this are, one, do these neighborhood effects extend beyond the amygdala? Are we just kind of looking at the same thing all the time and we're getting lucky? And to these other systems that we're interested? And then what are the mechanisms? So the neighborhood, it's living in disadvantaged neighborhoods. What is it about living around neighbors that have less resources? Again, that's not a context for a child. That's sort of like the broader milieu. So what is it about that context? And then we also really have been wanting to look much more about positive developments. Like, what are the buffers? Who's doing great things to help protect kids when they might be exposed to more disadvantage? So for these next studies, I'm going to talk about data from the Michigan Twin Neurogenetics Study that we call M-Twins. This is a collaboration with Alex Burt at Michigan State. And this is a sample of twins that were born in Southeast Michigan. She sampled 2 samples, one of which is from all the neighborhoods around and from birth records, but only sampling families who live in neighborhoods with above average levels of poverty. Now, to be clear, there's a really big range of family incomes in this. Like, if any of you know Michigan or Detroit, like you can live in the wealthiest part of Detroit and live 2 blocks from folks who are really struggling. So your census tract would be disadvantaged, but we have a really big range. But on average, families are living in more disadvantaged neighborhoods. So we sampled from that second one cohort, as well as anyone in the first that would have qualified. And we've brought in families, about 500 when they're in adolescence. She sampled them during childhood, and again for second wave after that. I'm just going to talk today about the data that we froze after COVID, because we're still cleaning the rest of the day. So this is on 350 families. So the first question is neighborhood disadvantage associated with other neural systems? And yes, we looked, grad student my lab, Heidi Westerman, looked at the cortical striatal system and response to reward. And we use this task. It's like a really simple version of a monetary incentive delay. It really just is looking at rewards. You flip a card. It's supposed to be fun. There's pirate islands for kids to do. But it engages the ventral striatum, which is an important part of this cortical striatal circuit. And she found that, yes, neighborhood disadvantage was related to greater reactivity in the ventral striatum during winds. Work by Rachel Tomlinson extended this to the prefrontal control system. So we used a task from BJ Casey, which is a whack-a-mole task. It's a go-no-go task. So you're supposed to inhibit yourself so that you don't hit the eggplants, but you want to whack the moles. And it has some disguises to make it hard, because during imaging, you have to go a little bit slower. And she found that neighborhood adversity was related to less activation in the inferior frontal gyrus, which is a really important part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex. That has to do with inhibitory control. And that in turn predicted response inhibition, that is how well kids did at not whacking the mole. And what's interesting in this study too is we purposely pitted other markers of SES, like family income and education, that have been studied a lot more. We found that they were related, but once you put neighborhood in there, it's the driving force. So again, maybe neighborhood is this sort of understudied area, although 5 years ago when I said that was true, now there's a lot of people doing neighborhood work and finding that neighborhood is pretty robustly associated with brain activity. Okay, but so what is it about the neighborhood? So we're focusing on sort of this poverty and concentration disadvantage, but this is a proxy for a host of exposures, whether it's the school you go to, what your water is like, whether you're exposed to old housing. One of the things that we were really interested in social exposures, and one of the ones, unfortunately, in lower income neighborhoods is there's greater exposure to community violence. So we wanted to know whether exposure to community violence might be related to, might help explain these connections between neighborhood disadvantage and amygdala activity. So this is work done by Gabby Suarez, who's a grad student in my lab, is on the job market if anyone is hiring. And she found that exposure to community violence is a mediator, a mechanism between neighborhood disadvantage and amygdala reactivity to threat. So this is the idea that maybe one of the reasons that living in a lower income neighborhood predicts your amygdala reactivity to threat is because you're exposed to more violence. Heidi also looked in the ventral striatum and had a really similar finding with a different task, which again, that exposure to community violence is a mechanism linking neighborhood disadvantage to ventral striatum reactivity to reward. So again, this suggests that one of the mechanisms is exposure to community violence. We're following up on a bunch of other ones, like exposure to toxicants, for example, like lead, as again, because living in a lower income neighborhood exposes you to a lot of other adversities. But I will say that honestly, one of my frustrations with a lot of this work, yeah. Yes. 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 Just checking. I'm checking the figure to make sure I'm not mistaken. Yes. Yes. Okay. So one of my frustrations in this work is that we're focusing only on negative things. And as a clinician who's worked in preventative intervention, lots of families are facing a lot of adversity, and that's really hard, but they're also doing a lot of great things and working to help protect their families. And so we really wanted to think about whether there were buffers in the environment that might help buffer kids against some of the effects of living in a disadvantaged neighborhood, or, for example, being exposed to community violence. And so going back to the work that I was talking about just a minute ago with Gabby, looking at exposure to community violence and neighborhood disadvantage, Gabby wanted to know, what if you have a really warm parent? you're a really warm and engaged parent, can they protect you from the exposure to community violence in terms of the effects on your brain? And she found that yes, they do. So parents who are more involved, this is during adolescence, were able to protect kids who lived in lower income neighborhoods from being exposed to as much violence. That's not new. There's a lot of research out there showing that. The idea is that involved parents in lower income neighborhoods can help protect their kids from going to the parts of the neighborhood or being exposed as much. So great. So involved parents are able to protect their kids from the exposures. The other question is, once that exposure happens, what happens for warm involved parents? And she again found that the association between exposure to community violence and amygdala activity is basically zero if you have a really warm parent. So that only exists, the association that I showed you before only really exists when parents aren't as involved. So again, want to highlight that for parents who can be really engaged, they can protect kids from these exposures. Okay, we also looked at, in the same sample, at neighborhood social processes. So having strong norms like collective efficacy and having the idea that parents and adults should look out for kids, even if they're not your own kids in the neighborhood. So you ask people, like, in general, are people, stopping a kid from doing something dangerous? Are they willing to help their neighbors? And she found in a registered report that neighborhood disadvantage is only related to amygdala activity in neighborhoods that had low levels of these positive norms. So again, this idea is that when neighbors have these positive norms, they're also protecting kids from these exposures and the sort of like brain effects of living in a disadvantaged neighborhood. Ariana Gard, who I talked about earlier, also looked at this in the SANS study. She looked at this in, I think, a kind of a cool way. She looked at geocoding of incidents of deadly gun violence within half a mile or 500 meters, like a quarter of a mile, from the family's house. And she found that, unfortunately, first of all, that luckily, lots of kids are not exposed, but many kids in the sample are exposed. She found in the national sample, which is about 5,000, that exposure to deadly gun violence was related to increased externalizing, which is not surprising. It's been documented elsewhere. But that if you lived in a neighborhood with high collective efficacy, again, families and adults working together, that buffered the association, so there wasn't an association. She also found in her SAN subsample that deadly gun violence was related to amygdala prefrontal cortex connectivity, but only if neighbors didn't have high collective efficacy. So again, more evidence that at the community level, adults can help buffer kids. Before I go on, I'll just say that one of the rubs here that I was worried about is the message is not that we need to get parents to be more involved or neighbors to be more involved, because actually the ways that we structure SES in the neighborhood undermines collective efficacy. So a lot of the initial work in Chicago that looked at collective efficacy also found that when you concentrate disadvantage, you make it hard for people to do this, right? So people are moving a lot. It's a lot harder to know your neighbors. And again, as I talked about earlier, when families are living in really high poverty, it's stressful and it's really hard to be an involved parent because you're working multiple jobs and you're not around as much and you're trying to juggle a lot of things. I think the point is that there are lots of families out there doing great things to help protect their kids, but also they're facing a lot of these structures. So just to summarize the work on this in terms of the brain and context, we think that parenting in neighborhood contexts shape neuroreactivity, and there are direct effects from harsh parenting and neighborhood effects. We think timing matters. Again, earlier exposures seem to affect earlier developing parts of the brain, later exposures to later developing parts of the brain. And again, this extends, I talked a lot about the amygdala, but also extends to reward and prefrontal systems. We think that some of these mechanisms have to do with more proximal exposures. So again, neighborhood disadvantage, one of those mechanisms might be exposure to community violence, but also that warm and involved parents and neighbors that work together and have shared norms can help buffer kids. And if you want to know more about this, we've summarized some of this work in a couple papers recently. So where are we going now with this? So we've also done a bunch of work on threat and deprivation, which I think Margaret Sheridan is coming later. So come in series, she'll tell you a lot more about that. This SAN is in collaboration with Chris Monk, and his lab is focused a lot more on that. He's done some cool stuff. Felicia Hardy, who just started a postdoc at Yale, looking at unpredictability. So if you're moving a lot as a kid and you have a less predictable life, and she found that that seems to be related to sort of global metrics of how your brain is organized, which in turn predicts depression. So we've been looking at these sort of ways of drawing together risk factors into dimensions. Right now, we're following up the sample at age 20. We're about to finish our age 20 data collection. It's about 500, so we've expanded the sample to other cities. We now fly them all in because There are only a couple cities close enough. And then we're now starting our age 24 wave where we'll bring back in those 500 families. One of the big extensions of this has been starting to look at structural racism in collaboration with Enrique Neblett at Michigan, who focuses on the impacts of racism, as well as Helen Meyer, who actually did some of this initial redlining of ways to code how we connect redlining to health outcomes. So that's some of the work that we're doing now in that sample. And in M-twins, we were going really well until COVID hit, and then that really made it hard to get families in anymore. So we're just trying to link to the finish. We're about 450 families the first wave and 300 the second wave. But as I'm going to talk about in a minute, we really need to we sample twins for a reason, and we need to use their twinness. And I'm going to undermine most of what I've said in a second when I show you some other work. But a lot of the focus out is on resilience, which I didn't talk about today, but is one of the main thrusts of that is understanding resilience for kids. Okay. All right, I'm going to just pause there if anyone has a quick question. Yeah. Sorry, say that again.
Like when you said the risk, like it affects the kids' risk.
So brain lines are showing a greater response to reward. We didn't have a good behavioral task to sort of see how they're actually responding to reward. I think like one of the theories that's influenced some of the way that we interpret some of this data is this idea of sort of fast versus slow life strategies. And the idea is that kids in some of these environments they're not like, their brain is adapting to the context they're in ways that are very functional, right? So being more attuned to threats is probably a good idea. Being more responsive to reward when you're not sure when you're going to get rewards and where there might not be a lot of resources is probably an adaptive thing. It's just that then when you change context on kids, that may not be as adaptive, if that makes sense. So again, this idea that you might be a little bit more reward dominant. Fast life strategies have sort of explained this as the idea that like, if you don't think you're going to live to be 80, then you should pursue things earlier in life because you don't want to have this kind of slow life strategy to wait until you're much older. Yeah.
Like in terms of like, so like more like say education, say income, like family only about like way for like selecting sample or like other way that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So I should have said basically all of our neighborhood papers we control for like anything we can that we think. So we are controlling for family resources, harsh parenting. So we think it's about a neighborhood specific exposure. That being said, that's like not a great way to do this in the sense of like a lot of these things are nested, right? It's not like there's so much variability that we can take that out. One of my students, Gabby, for her dissertation is doing latent profile analysis, actually just try to cluster the different parts of the neighborhood and exposures with this idea that it's not like we can separate these three things because it's not like one kid is exposed to this thing and another kid is that. There's like one kid is exposed to all three things and one kid's not exposed to any. So we're trying to see how they cluster and see if that tells us something about prediction. I think, but again, like natural experiments would be the best way to do this, right? So like if we could have done brain imaging with the moving to opportunity study where they actually move people to different neighborhoods, that would have been the strongest way to make measure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we do is we're using either resting state connectivity or we're actually using what we call pseudo rest, where we take all of our task data and we regress out the tasks. And then we have like 30 minutes of functional MRI, and then we make large scale networks and use graph theory.
Yeah. In your earlier slides, you talked about the response of the amygdala to fearful faces and neutral faces. Do you believe that's an inappropriate response, or like more shaped by the exposure to violence and exposure to people imperfect affect or diminished facial expression?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short-term context is very adaptive, right? So the pattern that we see with neutral has been consistent across all of us. There's always greater reactivity to neutral. For fearful and angry faces, it's been mixed across our studies. And so that gets more complicated when I try to like cram lots of studies together in a talk. But I think we see in some, like when you look at antisocial behavior, for example, you see potentially folks high on psychopathy as being more blunted and people not high on psychopathy, but still involved in antisocial behavior higher, with the idea that maybe one is very underreactive to others' emotions and other people are more reactive. That's like a really nice, neat story. Meta-analysis don't really support that well, but it is like what all of us write in papers and would like to think conceptually is true. Yeah. Okay, so partly I wanted to talk about antisocial behavior because except for that first study with Ariana, none of this actually talked about antisocial behavior. And my understanding was this is part of the lecture. So I also want to talk a little about our work on early callous and emotional traits. So one of the challenges about studying antisocial behavior is that if you go to like prisons and you get people who have like, done really bad things chronically over their life, all of them started their behavior early in life. You're not going to meet anyone who's had like multiple murder convictions who did not have early behavior problems. But the flip side of that is lots of kids have early behavior problems and they desist. So that is, we want to figure out why, figure out who is not going to desist. So if anyone here has had a 2 or 3 year old, even the normative 2 and 3 year old, this is the peak for aggression in the lifespan. It's a challenging time. But even kids who are elevated, most kids who are elevated in early life will actually desist. So the question is, how can we identify who's not going to desist? Because that's what we really want to target intervention. Otherwise, most of the kids are going to do better on their own. We don't need to intervene. So one of the ways that we thought about doing this was by looking at callous and emotional traits. This is a downward extension of the psychopathy construct. I want to be really clear. It's a risk factor for psychopathy, the same way high blood pressure is a risk factor for a heart attack, which means if you have high blood pressure, you might want to get it taken care of, but you are not going to have a heart attack now. In fact, you may never have a heart attack. And I think the longitudinal studies show that most people who in adulthood would be diagnosed with psychopathy would have had diagnosable levels of CU traits. But again, many kids who have CU traits will desist and will not have psychopathy later. So we got interested in this, and at the time really was mostly studied in adolescence and maybe later adulthood. And we wondered whether, and it predicts more severe antisocial behavior, predicts more proactive aggression rather than reactive aggression, and more chronic antisocial behavior. So it's a good way of identifying who's maybe not going to desist and who you really want to target because they have more severe levels of behavior. Okay, but until, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it really hadn't been studied earlier in childhood. There was 1 or 2 papers by Eva Kimonis on this, but otherwise we hadn't done a lot of work. So in collaboration with Becky Waller, who's back there, we started looking at early CU behaviors. That is, items that sounded like CU traits in later childhood, but then we want to be clear of behaviors because, again, we think it's a risk factor, but not necessarily, it's not like we're not studying preschool psychopaths. And by the way, if you've had a preschooler, you know that all of them are psychopaths at some point. They just kind of get better over time. So we did this in a large high-risk prevention trial called the Early Steps Project, which is the intervention is called the Family Checkup. We identified early CU behaviors from existing measures at age 3 and 4, like doesn't seem guilty, they're sneaky. And we found that it predicts a more homogeneous course of antisocial behavior. So these kids all were following this upward trajectory of chronic problems, where other kids were getting better and there was variability. We also found that kids in this early 3-4 range with these behaviors had a different nomological network to their behavior. So they were involved in more proactive behavior. They showed low moral regulation, lower empathy. And this was actually data from Sherry Olson's study in Ann Arbor. And then we also found in this large study that it predicted later CU traits at age 10. So it seemed to be what we're measuring early on does seem to be at least a risk factor for later CU traits. And that paper is kind of cool. You can look it up. Becky's the first author. We did this multi-trait, multi-method where we show that it really is preferentially at age 3. So if anyone tells you they can measure this before 3, don't believe them. 2-year-olds are a mess, and I don't think that you can find a whole lot. And actually, we found that basically mothers' perceptions seem to be driving later effects. That is, it's more about the mom's bias in the way they saw their kids than it was about the actual CU traits. So we think this is maybe a good way to identify who might need earlier intervention. But I will say here that these early CU behaviors did not moderate the effectiveness of this treatment. So kids that got this treatment, this preventative intervention with CU behaviors, did just as well as the kids who didn't. But we got really interested in what are the precursors of these earlier behaviors. And I was really interested in parenting, as you've seen from the talk. But there was some skepticism about whether parenting mattered, especially by people who study psychopathy. They basically said, well, this is really highly genetic, so parenting doesn't matter. But we know that for broader antisocial behavior, parenting is one of the most well-established risk factors. And in fact, it's the target for most interventions like parent management training, which is sort of like gold standard treatment. There's been decades of work on this by Jerry Patterson and others showing these coercive cycles where kids are more difficult, parents get harsher. And so, again, we thought this would be an important thing to look at. But there was skepticism in regard to CU traits because CU traits seem to be more highly heritable than antisocial behavior. And there were some, I would say, maybe poorly designed studies, or studies that weren't designed to answer this question, suggested that maybe parenting didn't matter or parenting interventions didn't work for kids with CU traits. So we got really determined and across in the early step sample, looked at harshness at age 2 and 3 using both parent reports and observations of harshness. We found that harsh parenting predicts CU behaviors a year later or 2 years later. We also found that parent warmth was important. So parents who had lower warmth with their kids in observational tasks, those kids a year later had high CU behaviors. And these are changes in CU behaviors from the year before. But what I'll also point out, though, is that kids who are more callous, their parents were less warm a year later, too. So there were some kind of child effects here, too. And that makes sense, right? If you have a kid who you think is kind of callous, it's going to be harder to engage with them. And part of that prompted this idea of like, well, are we really measuring parenting, or are we just measuring shared genes among the parents, right? Maybe this is just this gene environment correlation where harsher parents who are less empathetic have kids who are less empathetic. And so we knew that these could be these effective effects and these passive effects. So the way to solve this was to use behavior genetic designs, and we were fortunate to be able to collaborate with folks with an adoption study and then later with twin studies. So to do this, we can help separate out what's genetic versus environmental. And I was telling Martha earlier, I'm really interested in these behavior genetic designs, not because I care about the heritability, but because I want to see what's actually environmental, have a little bit more confidence in it. So the first way we did this was with an adoption sample called the Early Growth and Development Study. It's run by Leslie Levin and Janae Niederheiser. And they have this really cool study of linked adoptive families where the kids were adopted on average within 2 days of birth. So they really haven't had much other than prenatal exposure to their birth parents. And the design here is that if the birth parents' behaviors are linked to the kid, then you can think those are probably genetic effects, right? Because they haven't spent much time around their kids. If you see adoptive parenting effects, you could think these are like non-genetic effects because the parents and the kids are not genetically related. And if you see an interaction between those, this is what we call a gene environment interaction, where we're seeing the kids' genes and the parenting interact. And so we looked at birth mother's severe antisocial behavior, which I think Becky called something that would get you arrested, and found that that did predict early CU behavior at 27 months. So the idea is that even though these parents hadn't been around, the birth parents hadn't been around the kids, their history of severe antisocial behavior predicted earlier CU behaviors. But we also saw that the adoptive mother's positive reinforcement during an observational task where I ask kids to clean up, stressful when you have a 2-year-old and you give them really nice toys and you make them clean up. We saw that moms who had more positive reinforcement had kids with lower CU behaviors. And again, we think this is probably not genetic. The kid and the parent are not related. We also saw an interaction between these, and I'll show you the graph. So for parents who were not very warm or weren't positive reinforcement, see this positive association between the biological mother's antisocial behavior and the kid's CU traits, right? That's what I told you before. But if adoptive moms were really high on positive reinforcement, there's no association. So this idea is that this adoptive mom can essentially knock out the genetic risk, right? So the kids that had parents who were more antisocial, but if they had a really warm adoptive parent, now they don't seem to be at higher risk for CU behaviors. So from there, we went on to twin studies because adoption, I sort of didn't mention, kids can still evoke their environment, so the genes can still play a role. So another way to get at this is to use identical twins. And if one twin is treated differently than the other twin, and believe it or not, this actually happens. I was skeptical, but actually there's really big differences in how parents parent their twins. Is anyone here a twin? There's always a twin in the audience. Would you agree? Parents parent differently? Totally. Without fail, there's always a twin in the audience, and they always agree. Okay. So for an example, if we see that one kid is spanked and one kid isn't spanked, the kid who's spanked ends up being the kid has conduct problems, we know that can't be genetic, right? They have identical DNA. So we think we can be more confident that it's environmental. And in fact, that's what we found in a study with Alex Burt. We looked at a range, this kind of cool multiverse approach, a range of from spanking to harsh parenting, found that whichever kid received harsher parenting ended up more likely to be the kid that had conduct problems. So this idea is that there's definitely this parenting effect. And there's actually been a bunch of other literature on antisocial behavior broadly by folks like Sarah Jaffe, who's here at Penn. So we wanted to ask this about CU traits in middle childhood. And this is the study that we sampled M twins from. So these are families, half of which are oversampled from neighborhoods with adversity. And Becky led this paper. And we found that the twins who were more more harshly parented and had lower warmth were more likely to have CU traits. Kids who were more harshly treated also were more likely to be aggressive. So this idea is that parenting does seem to have a role, and maybe warmth is particularly important for CU behaviors. From there, we got interested in sort of whether parenting and CU traits overlap. And we can do this with some fancy twin modeling. And this is led by Rachel Tomlinson, who's at UCSF now. And we found that CU traits are sort of moderately heritable, like 50%, but also environmental. Everything, by the way, secret is everything's a little bit heritable and everything's a little bit environmental. But what we can do is figure out how much of the association between parenting and CU traits is due to shared genes or due to unique environments. And for harsh parenting, there's an association between harsh parenting and CU traits about 0.3, but 90% of that association is actually due to shared genes. So a lot of that association seems to be gene-environment correlation. For warmth, though, warmth wasn't as highly related. It was only about 0.13 with CU traits, but over half of that association is due to the environment, to non-shared environment. And so again, this has this idea that the environment, some of that association is due to the environment. And it's like the identical twin study I showed you before. But what's also interesting, you can look at this interaction to see whether parenting can change the heritability of CU traits. And we found basically the same thing as we did in the adoption study, which is that parents who are more involved, so A is heritability here, which is that when parents are not very involved, it's very highly heritable. But as parents get more and more involved, there's less heritability to CU traits. Same thing for parent-child conflict or harsh parenting, that as parents get harsher, it gets more heritable. So this idea is, again, that parents who are warmer might be able to buffer the genetic risk. Of course, in most families, they're not adopted, so the parent is genetically related. They might also have that risk, which is important to think about. Okay, so just to summarize the work on CU traits, parenting is associated with CU trait development, harshness, and low warmth. Some of this is genetic confounding, but some of this we think is environmental, and especially for warmth, seems to have the most consistent environmental effects. There are definitely gene-environment interactions where parenting is buffering against this genetic risk. And we think that both probably increasing warmth and lowering harshness in treatment will be important for kids with CU traits. We're continuing to look at the neural correlates of CU traits and antisocial behavior, but especially sort of like longitudinal ones. And then as our M-twin study, as we wrap up and get a big enough sample, we have to start doing this with the brain imaging. So I gave this talk once and somebody said, does the last third of your talk undermine the whole first third? Yes. The point is that the stuff that we're doing on neighborhoods and parenting and SES in the brain could all be gene environment correlation. And so what we're really trying to move to next is starting to use this twin design to parse that and figure out which of these effects are really about parents. The neighborhood's harder, by the way, because twins live in the same neighborhood, so we can't split them out that way. But at least within parenting, we can look at whether differences in parenting are related to differences in brain function. So I just want to thank the many collaborators. We've been really fortunate to be able to collaborate on a lot of different samples and studies. Thank you all for having me here. And I'm happy to have any questions.